Addiction is hell. And as Sir Winston Churchill said, if you are going through hell, keep going. Now, some folks don't think he actually said that. And some folks think he said, if you're going through hell, don't stop. Either way, bottom line is, when it comes to addiction, if you're already there, keep on going through it. Keep powering your way through it. If you make an effort, if you learn a few things, and if you try, you can get through and come out the other end and have a good life. Welcome everyone to the 9 Principles of Spiritual Recovery channel. I'm Ken, your guide through this video. We're beginning our focus on substance abuse or drug addiction. Either terminology is fine for our purposes. Our prior video was the 9 Principles News for August, and it contained a presentation on substance abuse and why we're making it our focus on the channel. It seems like a timely issue that many people are dealing with. We know drug overdoses in the U.S. are probably at record levels, but exact figures are kind of hard to come by during the pandemic. Certainly the global health crisis impacted many people's mental health, and many people have turned to drug and alcohol use to try to find some relief from the stress that COVID has caused us all. We hope that this channel can provide some information and ideas that can help folks struggling with addiction, and that also includes non-substance or so-called process addictions like gambling, work, exercise, shopping, sex, so on. Some people have become, in a sense, even addicted to their mental health conditions, such as depression, anxiety, and anger. Some people who, were rarely noticeably angry before COVID have become kind of different people, or what we might call anger addicts, who try to cope with their stressors by getting and staying angry. Now, it's easy to do because anger releases chemicals in the body that make people feel awake and alive due to their release resulting from the fight or flight response. The problem is that recovering from the increase in blood sugar and cortisol triggered by the fight or flight response takes a while before they return to normal levels. In the meantime, people are kind of running around on pissed off juice, jacked up on that, and they can get into all kinds of trouble, from legal to relationship problems, anything in between. So in a very real way, these folks, these anger addicts, get hooked on the feeling they get when they're angry, stimulated and strangely in their minds in control of their environments. But that's just addicted thinking taking over. So buckle up, and we'll get going on this journey into addiction and spiritual recovery from it. Now, back in the old days, I used to do some marketing consulting work and used to develop strategic plans for different organizations. And part of that was mission statement development. And so back around 2006, I started thinking about my own kind of purpose and my own mission in life, and took the things that I knew about developing strategic plans and applied it to my own personal situation. So I came up with 3 different things that ended up being part of my personal spiritual mission statement. And the last of them was to learn and teach practical spirituality. Now, for most of the past 15 years, I've been actively doing that. I've studied what caught my eye, seemed interesting to me. I've studied quite a few different things over the years, different philosophies, modalities, you name it. I've learned and taught people a practical or spiritual approach to dealing with substance abuse and anger. I've taught classes about astrology. I've done Reiki healing courses. I'm a master teacher level practitioner. And again, I've done personal spiritual mission statement development with folks. So let's talk about drugs. Everything from acetaminophen to zombie drugs. So what is a drug? Basically, easy way to remember is any chemical substance that once inside the human body causes a change in the body's function. Anything like aspirin, fentanyl, nicotine, sildenafil, you name it. Naproxen, all of those things cause changes in the way the body functions, and we take them generally for some sort of relief from some sort of pain or other health symptom. Drug use. Reasonable definition is the use of chemical substances in an attempt to cope with stressors in order to find relief from the effects of those stressors. Problem is, it's a maladaptive coping skill over time. Means it doesn't work over time. Causes more problems than it ever resolves. Let's talk about levels of drug use. Usually the entry level, usually the first level, and where most people end up is some sort of substance use or even misuse. Maybe drinking a little too much, too often, that kind of thing. Nothing too problematic. We go up to the abuse level. That's when things start to get a little bit trickier. Start feeling like you're compelled to use, or at least you go to the same maladaptive coping skill over and over and over again. You start to settle in on one thing that seems to work. But that's when you're starting to have problems. And then substance dependence, or what we call addiction. That's the final level, the higher level. And that's when you feel compelled. You really don't feel like you have much of a choice. You don't really think about too much other than the substance that you're using, how to find it, how to use it, how to pay for it, how to recover from it. So substance abuse is all of these things. Cravings to use, wanting to cut down or stop but not being able to, using in larger amounts or for longer periods of time than you meant to, neglecting other parts of your life because of that, continuing to use even when it causes problems, relationships, other things, money problems, legal problems, and using even when it puts you in physical danger, becomes a safety issue. So substance abuse or self-abuse. Now, to my thinking, since a chemical substance hasn't got any feelings, physical or emotional, then it can't really be abused in any way. It has no senses to be abused. However, since human beings do have feelings, both physical and emotional, then they can be abused in any number of ways. So for me, substance abuse is drug addiction, period. And addiction is, in terms of chemicals, substance-based, the compulsive use of chemical substances to cause changes in the brain's function to make the user feel some relief from life stressors. So that's one type of an addiction. A second type is process-based addictions. This would be the compulsive involvement in activities to cause changes in the brain's function to make the user feel some relief from life stressors. This would be things like gambling, shopping, sex, work, going to the gym, all of those sorts of activities that start off as a nice stress relief and end up becoming a compulsion. And because we're compelled to do them, we neglect other parts of life and other things start to fall apart. So addiction is physiological and biological in nature, has a physical body component to it. You find that out, especially if you stop using drugs and go through any kind of withdrawal that's physical in nature. Psychological, having to do with the brain, the mind, the way we think and feel. And the third aspect is the sociological, or the group aspect, how we get along in groups, what groups do for us, and especially in terms of maintaining an addiction. We call mutual use society. That's what addiction is. Everybody's just kind of using each other up. So according to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, or ASAM, drug addiction is a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. Now I would add too, I think the AMA, the American Medical Association, calls relapsing part of the disease as well. Relapsing, basically you stop using for a period of time and then you pick up use again. Usually there's a reason for that. We'll go into that a lot more. So when it comes to these brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences, we're talking about things like neurology, or the nerves in our bodies, genetics, how we're hardwired, what kinds of things we're predisposed to, how we're pretty much wired to respond to changes in our environment, and social psychology. Again, how we function within groups, what needs we have met by groups, and especially in addiction, it's a very important component. Next, we have these models of addiction, and different models have prevailed at different times in our history, depending on culture, science. And back during our colonial period, 1600s, 1700s, even 1800s, the moral model prevailed, which viewed addiction as a character flaw and a sin. And that justified punishing people who were addicted, generally to alcohol, with beatings, fines, public humiliation, jail terms. And if you ever saw the John Adams miniseries on HBO, there's a scene in there where he confronts his son, Charles, over his drinking. And it's pretty powerful stuff. And that is a perfect example of the extent to which the moral model prevailed. Currently, we have a propensity to follow the disease model. And this kind of suggests that addiction is a chronic relapsing disease that is progressive, gets worse, unless it's treated by lifelong abstinence. That would be similar to, say, diabetes, where if you didn't control your intake of sugar, your disease would get worse and worse and worse. And that's kind of the model for addiction at this point. Chemical addiction anyway, substance addiction. Psychodynamic model, that's another model. Links up problems back to our childhoods. You see that a lot in talk therapy and counseling. The social learning model, basically that we learn how to respond to our stressors. The way we cope is we watch other people, and however they cope, we follow that as a model. The sociocultural model kind of focuses on society as a whole, not just individuals. Drug use is kind of a macro illness and needs to be addressed at the macro level. Some folks would say that there is a spiritual model of addiction. A woman named Anodia Judith has written on this topic, and she correlates addiction with the 7 chakra system. And if you kind of look at that list there, this would be where you might have a blockage in your energy fields. And depending on what type of blockage you have, it would show where your addiction comes from and what type of addiction you could expect. And, well, I guess I probably follow in there at the green level. Who knows? Probably all the way up and down. But anyway, you can find yourself in there if you want to. I think it actually makes a little bit of sense, so I kind of like it. So why is recovery so difficult? It's because relapse is so easy. According to a study by Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, we have over 6,000 thoughts a day as a human being. 6,000. Now, even if 100 of those were about using your substance of choice in order to cope with a stressor, you got to fight off 100 different threats a day. Now think about that. It's going to be pretty tough. Can be done, but it takes a lot of effort, a lot of discipline, a lot of retraining the mind, a lot of skill development, but it can be done. Now, the human brain is programmed to seek, say it with me, children, pleasure. Now, you think about it. If you have 6,000 thoughts a day, some of them are going to be about pleasure, some aren't. Some are going to be about the things that stress you out. And some of those things you think are going to be how to handle those things that stress you out. Whoops. Whoops. Uh-oh. Uh-huh. Go up. Okay. Yep. Oh, yeah, that one. Oh, yeah. Definitely. Oh, boy. Yep. Oh, yeah, jackpot. Anybody been triggered by any of these? Now, if one of these is your go-to when you're stressed out, and you think about that 100 times a day, you're going to have real trouble fending that off. And it's going to take a lot of effort. And it's going to take a lot of support, too. So dopamine and addiction, this is kind of the central aspect of the disease model, that the neurotransmitter dopamine kind of regulates your pleasure response. So we start off with this green line, and that is pretty much what we're going to call the normal dopamine level. And I call this in the belly of the whale. You'll see in a minute why. So we get this normal dopamine level that we're going along with, and then all of a sudden we start using drugs for whatever reason, dealing with some sort of a stressor. May start out small, couple of drinks, a couple nights a week, something like that, something manageable, not a big deal. Then the drug use becomes compulsion. Dopamine is artificially increased. That's what's represented by this blue line. Tolerance increases at the same time. And while that's going on, you're getting a natural dopamine decrease. Your brain stops producing as much because it doesn't want to get overheated. And if you're doing something that's causing an artificial dopamine increase, the brain's going to adjust. And so everything now naturally is below the normal dopamine level. Now, sometimes before we start to see the increase in artificial dopamine because of use, we actually might see a little dopamine drop off because of the stressors that we're experiencing. And that might trigger us into the drug use to begin with as a coping mechanism. Then we get to a certain point where we kind of go, oh, I'm going to have to stop this. It's causing trouble. Whatever reason, get busted for an OUI. Spouse says, knock it off or I'm gone. Money trouble, lose a job. Boss says, quit it or you're going to be done. That kind of thing. So once we stop using, kind of go through this withdrawal. And that can be physical, can be mental, can be both. And once we get down into this area where we're no longer artificially increasing dopamine and we're still subject to that natural decrease in dopamine, we're in an area where we're vulnerable to relapse. Compulsion is really going to be kicking in down there, and you're going to be susceptible to relapse. And that's where that thinking comes into play. Those 6,000 thoughts a day, you might have trouble. All of us would. So what happens is, over time, natural dopamine increases again, makes up for the difference in the artificial dopamine increase, and you get back to normal dopamine levels. And that would be recovery. And what happens in relapse is over time, sometimes folks' stressors build up. They kind of forget what kept them abstinent or kept them out of trouble with their substance use. And you see the dopamine, the natural levels drop off again, and we start the whole process. And what happens then? We experience the opposite of pleasure. Stress. Stress. Pain. Loss. Suffering. Disease. Unhappiness. Grief. So this is where we start to get a little circular. So you get stress, which is the response that an organism has to any kind of outside pressure or demand placed on it. And that stress, that feeling, actually causes other problems. Because when we feel that way, we're looking for some kind of relief from it. And in the terms of addiction, that relief becomes a stressor in and of itself. Stressors, talked about these before, problems, pressures, demands, threats, and traumas. So stressors can overwhelm our ability to cope with them just by their nature. They cause stress, and sometimes we don't have the tools to deal with that stress. We don't have any coping skills because we've never had to learn them or never did learn them. We have poor coping skills. We may have learned some, but they're not all that effective. And then we have maladaptive coping skills. These probably worked for a little while, but over the course of time stopped working and started causing trouble. So just like we had stress-producing stressors, now we have stressors causing stress. It's a beautiful thing. So we have this cycle here where stress, or the response we feel to outside influences that put pressure or demands on us, causing stressors. And we have stressors causing stress. And it gets to be kind of a dog chasing its tail kind of deal. And you're never really sure where one starts and the other stops. But the idea is we come up with an intervention, a way to cope with our stressors so that it reduces our stress. And if we have reduced stress levels, that in turn will cause us less stressors or fewer stressors. And so we should see improvements in life. So this whole issue of drug addiction, from kind of a cause and effect perspective, we start off with the cause of drug addiction being stress. And we know stress to be the response an organism has to a perceived or actual threat from outside itself that either puts pressures or demands on it. So people get stressed. They use drugs to try to cope. Now, we know stress is a stressor. So that response that we have to outside threats becomes a stressor in itself. It actually causes us more stress. Stress causes more stress. The stressors are the main effect of drug addiction, which then cause the stress again that people experience as a result. This whole thing goes around and around and around. People use drugs to try to cope with stressors, but drug use ends up causing more stress to try to cope with. So it's just, again, dog chasing its tail. So when it comes to addiction, we can expect some losses in terms of our 6 dimensions of wellness model. That would be in the physical aspect of health, the emotional aspects of health, the intellectual or the mental aspect of health, our social health, occupational health, and our spiritual health. Now, addiction is addiction is addiction. Doesn't matter. The form the addiction take doesn't matter up to a point. We'll talk about this. As much as the process of becoming addicted to something is the important factor in recovery from the addiction. Now, the way in is also the way out. I want to just go back for a second. The form the addiction take doesn't really matter that much, except for kind of the lethality of the drug being used. So if someone has a heroin addiction, that's obviously much more severe and serious than maybe somebody who does something that's not quite as lethal or fatal if it's misused to a ridiculous level. So it does matter in terms of lethality. And early on in recovery from addiction, the why, how, and if questions are much more critical to answer than anything like what, where, when, and even the who questions. Now, I wish I had a buck for every time I've heard this one, but addiction, it's not about the wrong people. I have heard that one a million times. It's not about the wrong people. I'm going to write a book called The Wrong People someday, by the way. So it's not about the wrong people. It's about wrong thinking. So we see where this fellow's got his head. I think I see the real problem here. So if you've been watching these videos, you know we've talked about this cycle called the stressors to behavior cycle. When it comes to drug addictions, that thing gone wild. Basically, there's 9 phases of the stressors to behavior cycle are included in this description. But basically, our stressors produce uncomfortable feelings, and we try to find a way to get relief from those feelings. So we end up indulging these kind of compulsive, addictive behaviors to do that. And in the process, our thoughts, desires, attitudes, beliefs, values, intentions, and our behaviors either reinforce the stressor or resolve it. But in the case of addiction, reinforces the stressor, causing the addicted person to re-experience the stressor or other related stressors, and the unhealthy cycle continues on and on and on and on. So when it comes to drug addiction, addiction is a cause and an effect in itself. It's both. Addiction causes more trouble, causes problems, causes pressure, it causes demands, threats, traumas, those being the effects of the addiction. And again, cause and effect, that law is also known as the law of karma. Karma simply being about action. And in this case, actions are the use of drugs to addictive levels where you feel compelled to use. And at that point, you really don't have control over your actions. And it does become the dog chasing its tail. So drug addiction can be considered a karma cycle, a cycle of action, of cause and effect. And again, the dog chasing its tail. So what's the solution to this karmic cycle of use and recovery and use and recovery and use and recovery? What's the solution? Obviously, it would be an intervention of some sort where we can stop using for good. So what is intervention? It's the interruption of out-of-control drug use long enough to try a different coping skill to address the stress and stressors that lead to the drug addiction to begin with. Now, some of you folks may have seen this show on television. It's on the A&E channel, A&E network, called Intervention. It's been on for years and years and years. This clip that I see says season 24, episode 6. So this thing has been on forever, probably as long as A&E's been on TV. But it's kind of cracks me up. Every time I've watched this show, they go through this whole process and you get to the end and it's always the parents' fault. For some reason, it's always the parents' fault. So tuck that one away. So when we talk about interventions, think back, we talked about the stressors to behavior cycle and that there were intervention points along the way in this cycle. Everywhere you see a break between one phase and the next, so say between stressors and feelings, feelings and thoughts, thoughts, desires, and so on. Everywhere you see one of these spots is a place where we can stop ourselves in our process once we've identified a stressor that we want to resolve, and we've developed kind of a quick plan for how to do that. Each one of these phases is part of that plan, and if we see that we're not doing so well in a particular phase, we're not actually working toward resolution of the stressor, we can stop ourselves, adjust, and make a change to the plan that we have, and then proceed on. So recovery means getting back our innate ability to change and grow and cope with our life stressors. So when you think about recovery and relapse, recovery is a pretty involved process. Relapse is a heck of a lot easier. That's why it happens so much more than recovery. And we recover through the development of our spiritual practices, healthy coping skills. So when it comes to addiction recovery, how do we do it? Well, we have to develop a plan for change and growth in recovery. We have to develop spiritual practices, and we have to figure out what our personal mission is in life. What's our purpose? Once we find that, it helps a lot to lead us sometimes to stress, but sometimes it leads us to real happiness. So again, how do we do this recovery thing? We assess our life experiences, our stressors, plan for coping with those stressors, which includes developing coping skills. And when it comes to 9 principles of spiritual recovery, those spiritual practices are the coping skills. Reauthorization, reconnection, reconciliation, reciprocation, rededication, redemption, all of those things. They're all coping skills. And we also have to plan for developing our resources, the ones that we have, the ones that we need. And things that we might need would be transportation, money, folks that would be able to give us a hand when we need one, technology, that sort of resource. And then we also, again, finding a plan for how to fulfill our life's purpose once we figure it out. You should have clients all the time. I want to be of service to other people. I want to be of service to other people. And I used to tell them, well, first of all, deal with your addiction. If you want to be of service to other people, don't be a burden to them, first and foremost. So again, in recovery, you want to ask ourselves some questions ahead of time. Where have I come from? How did I ever become addicted to begin with? What are my life stressors? What coping skills do I lack? And what resources do I need? And what might be my life's purpose? May not want to work on that today, but at some point, you're going to want to do that. So I talked about the 9 principles of spiritual recovery before. Again, it's a set of 9 spiritual practices that can be developed to implement a plan for change and growth in recovery from significant and stressful life experiences. These 9 principles are reauthorization, reciprocation, reconciliation, reconnection, rededication, redemption, reformation, resolution, and restoration. And I put these up here in alphabetical order. I don't believe anyone's any more important than the other. And my experience is that I've worked on 1, 2, 3 of these at the same time. And generally, most folks who work within this process will work on more than one of these at a time. This graphic kind of shows the interconnected nature of all of these spiritual practices. They all kind of feed into each other. That's why there's really no linear process here. You don't do one and then the next and then the next and then the next. You can be working on these anytime you want to. And it probably helps, I would think, to be able to kind of spread your focus around a little bit. Maybe kind of think about how what you're working on, say in reconciliation, might apply to resolution as well, or reciprocation as well. Now, if you're experiencing some sort of an issue with substance abuse, mental health conditions, anything that you're struggling with, you might want to give some of these folks a shot. For Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is the new 988 lifeline.org number. The SAMHSA National Helpline is the 800-662-HELP. It's also USA.gov, which doesn't look like an emergency site, but another place you can find some information as well. Now, I've heard that there are changes in emergency phone numbers around the country. But as far as I know, if you are in an emergency situation, an overdose situation, suicide situation, anything where you're scared, nervous, need help, still call 911. This time, I'd like to take just a few seconds of silence to remember the folks that we've lost. We've lost a lot of folks to COVID in the last couple of years, but we've lost a lot of folks to mental health conditions, to substance use, overdose, suicides. We've lost a lot of folks, and I'd just like to take a few seconds to remember them. Thanks. Thank you. So I want to thank you all for watching this video through to the end. The next video will start the 9 principles discussion, and that will be first in the alphabet, reauthorization. And as always, if you found something in this video to like, please consider hitting the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you feel it. And if you do, hit the notification bell. Feel free to share this video with others who might be of a like mind. And also feel free to put a comment in the comment section. And just play nice. Till next time, everybody. Thanks again for watching. Take care of yourselves.